And so those the big T's, but those small T's can be there without us necessarily knowing, and they can add up over time, right? That neglect or that low level of criticism can just add up over time to where obviously that's being manifested in what we see today by these large scale societal symptoms that you're observing.
Well, when you talked about your sense that you can't trust anybody, you can't trust the world. I mean, that's devastating for a child. Now project that into the COVID crisis, and all the mistrust and all the suspicion and all the rancor, I mean, on all sides. To me, it didn't just speak about the urgency of the issues being discussed. It's also talked about who was doing the discussing. A lot of people who didn't trust, but the lack of trust. Now, there's all kinds of good reasons not to trust governments and corporations and so on. I mean, I talk about that in the book, there's all kinds of, overall, I don't have a conspiracy theory view of the world, but there certainly are conspiracies that we know this all the time. People telling us lies and selling us stuff we don't need and telling us it's good for us when it's bad for us, all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, a lot of the suspicion and rancor that I saw on the COVID debate, I was seeing the impact of childhood trauma, where people just couldn't even consider another point of view, no matter from what side, and just the suspicion, well, if a child is given the sense early that the world is not trustworthy, that's going to show up in politics. That's going to show up in our social discourse.
Right. So I see what you're saying. It was almost like the COVID perturbed the system. And from that tremor, you could see the embodiment of perhaps decades of trauma on a society, on the world. And now you could see these reactions that just didn't seem logical, normal, but we had never had a society this traumatized. And so that's I guess that's what you witnessed when you saw that.
That sums it up. I remember reading about a pastor and about podcaster in Florida, who apparently has got hundreds of thousands of followers. And he believed that the vaccine was a conspiracy by the Clintons and Bill Gates to introduce a microchip into people's circulations to control them. Okay? Now, if this guy went to a doctor and said, I believe that there's a conspiracy to put a microchip into my circulation so that I could be controlled, he'd be diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. But when you put it into the COVID debate, it sounded plausible to a lot of people. Now, it's not that I put conspiracies past the Clintons or the Gates or anybody, anything is possible in this world. But for one thing, I don't think they have the technology yet to introduce microchips into people's circulations through a vaccine, on the most basic level. But when I thought about that man who had that theory, I thought, well, at some point, from an emotional point of view, it makes sense, because I'm pretty sure that at some point, he probably was very small and very helpless, and people were controlling him in a way that was harmful to him. In other words, he was projecting into the political debate a personal experience of trauma, not realizing that that's what he's doing. So that, to me, there's always a kind of emotional sense behind even the most fanciful ideas, that even if the content of the ideas seems self-evident nonsense, the emotional contact, I think, comes from trauma.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned medication earlier, and I'd love to talk about it. I think you said at one point that 70% of all adult Americans are on a medication.
Something like 70% are at least on one medication, yeah.
And 40% are on two or more.
That's the statistic that I saw from the Mayo Clinic, I think.
What do you make of that? And as a doctor yourself, what is the right amount? What is the solution? What is the future? What does that tell you?
So we can look upon pathology as individual misfortune or genetic inheritance. But that doesn't explain why I think the rising rate of people on medications, because genes don't change over a short period of time. Now, if you put aside the issue of individual pathology, and if you say, well, what's going on in a society, then you have to understand the scientific basis. This is not fancy. This is not intuition. It's not conjecture. People are actually biopsychosocial creatures. That means that our biology is very much affected by our psychology. And needless to say, our psychology cannot help be affected by our social relationships from in utero onwards. So we already know from lots of studies that the emotional states of the mother while she's carrying the baby has an impact on the brain development of the fetus and on the future physiology of the infant. You can trace this for decades after the pregnancy itself. So, in other words, the emotional states of the mother affect the physiology of the infant, but the emotional states of the mother are obviously connected to her social situation, her economic status, her own family history, her own history of trauma, her own race, and so on. So that what we call individual pathology is actually the manifestation of a biopsychosocial process. That's our scientific nature, or scientifically stated, that's our nature as human beings. So therefore, we can, now indigenous, by the way, I know you and I have both worked with indigenous modalities, and indigenous cultures have always understood this. They didn't have the science that we have, and thank God for the science that we do have. But our science has become so narrowed. So a friend of mine, a Lakota Sioux, partial Lakota Sioux, born American physician and psychiatrist, Dr. Louis Mel Madrona, told me that in his Lakota tradition, when somebody got ill, the whole community would kind of gather and say, thank you. Your illness manifests some imbalance in the whole community. So that you're not alone in this, and your healing is our healing. And from a scientific point of view, that's absolutely true. It's just that Western medicine ignores both that traditional wisdom and all the science that proves that traditional wisdom. So we really are biopsychosocial creatures. If that's the case, then if we have to want to look at the sources of the rising tide of illnesses, physical and mental, we have to look at social conditions and social relationships and the whole nature of the culture that we inhabit and the values that we live by and how we treat each other and how we interact with each other and the kind of stresses that we live under. That's just pure science. And again, I cannot emphasize the frustration sometimes that looking at the gap between what science has shown and what physicians practice, and it's not their fault, dear souls, it's because there's nothing in their education prepares them for it. Not only that, physicians themselves are so traumatized by their training that they just don't look at these issues because they're too painful.
The greedy bankers are about to do it again. In 2008, they crashed our financial system and nearly bankrupted the entire global economy. Then they received trillions of dollars in government bailouts. And after, they demanded fat bonuses paid for by you, the taxpayer.
It turns out the banks haven't just been screwing the American taxpayers, they're also screwing over their investors. Turns out the banking industry is the worst place you could put your money, despite enormous taxpayer bailouts.
Now the bankers are back to take away your financial freedom. They lie and tell you that cryptocurrency isn't safe. They try to make it illegal for you to choose how to invest your hard-earned money. They lie and say cryptocurrency is used by money launderers and criminals. But look at the record. It's the banks themselves that launder hundreds of billions of dollars every year to the biggest criminal operations in the world.
Leaked documents have revealed how some UK banks have helped criminals, money launderers and Russians under sanctions.
American authorities discovered that the Sinaloa cartel moved $881 million through HSBC accounts as bank officials turned a blind eye to the illegality.
The bankers lie and say cryptocurrency is not a real investment. Meanwhile, the smartest CEOs in the world are buying billions and billions of it. The truth is that banks lie about cryptocurrency because it makes them scared. The banks take $9 trillion per year of your hard-earned money, and they are worried that they will finally be exposed. They're scared Because crypto means they can no longer control your money, which means they can no longer control you. They are scared because you might actually understand your money and intelligently decide what to do with it. Now is the time for us to come together, fight back, and take control. It's time to educate ourselves, our families, and our communities. Because financial education means financial freedom. We know that cryptocurrencies will help us build the new decentralized financial system of the future. A banking system that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. A banking system where access to finance is a fundamental human right. A banking system that is free and fair and welcomes all humans on this earth. The DeFi revolution is happening. We, the people, can no longer be fooled. We choose to take control of our finances. We choose to take control of our freedom. We choose to take control of our future. Join us, and let's take back our financial freedom forever.